In this video, I'm gonna demonstrate how to combine an ASP.NET Core version 6 minimal web API with the popular front-end JavaScript library React, so that at the end of it, you'll have a minimal example on how to combine the two. I have challenged myself to build the app for this tutorial and explain it to you within an hour. And so I'll set a stopwatch to see how that works out. In this video, I also cover publishing them both to Azure. We'll publish the React app to an Azure Static Web App resource and use GitHub Actions, so that we'll even set up a simple continuous integration pipeline for it. We'll publish the ASP.NET Web API to an Azure App Service resource. So I'm Ruben, and it's my goal to help people learn software development with C# and .NET. And I do that by creating educational content about it. You can check out a live demo and download the source code created in this tutorial via the links in the description below. Right, so what you've been seeing behind me is the end result of this tutorial. And this is a React app running in the Microsoft Azure Cloud. If we click Get Posts from Server, we get the posts from our ASP.NET Web API, and it displays them inside this little table. And in this tutorial, we'll work with just one very simple model called the post model, and it only has 3 fields: a standard ID field called post ID of type int, which is also the primary key, so that we can uniquely identify each post. We also have a text field called title, and lastly another text field called content. So in this little demo app, we can do all the CRUD operations on that posts table, meaning we can create new posts, read out the existing ones, update them, and delete them. And we can do this via a React UI, which talks to an ASP.NET Core version 6 minimal web APIs. And those APIs use Entity Framework Core to do the database operations on a SQLite database. Right, so now I want to demonstrate the CRUD operations. So let's create a new post, and I'll just change the title to new post and change the content to new post content and hit submit. And then we see an alert that it worked, and let's click OK to see the result. And there we go, we see that our new post has been added to the bottom of the table. And if we hit the update button for that post, we can update it. So I'll just change the post content to updated. So new post updated and new post content updated, and hit submit. Then we see another alert that it worked and that it will show up in the database. So I just hit OK. And now we see that the content has been changed to updated. Awesome. Then finally, let's try deleting this post, and an alert shows up asking if we're sure. Yes, we're sure. And I'm just gonna hit OK. And then it shows another alert that it worked and that we should look at the table to see it disappear. So I'm gonna hit OK again. And there we go, we see that the post disappeared from the table. Awesome. So that's all the CRUD operations. There's one more button below the table, and if we click that, we just empty the post array in React, and then the table will no longer show. If we click Get Posts from Server again, we're kinda back at where we started. Okay, so let's get started building this little application. But before we continue, I have a special message for you. So you have done the basic tutorials. You kind of understand C#, HTML, CSS and ASP.NET, but you don't feel fully ready yet to tackle a real-world application alone. Well, if that's you, then I have created the perfect course for you, and you've been seeing the end product of it playing behind me. It's a project-based course, and in it we'll create a developer portfolio web app from scratch. It's basically the course I wish existed when I started learning C# and ASP.NET. You can get it for only $15 via the discount link in the description below. Now let's continue with the subject of this video. Right, so let's start off with setting up our developer environment. The IDE I'll use for our web API is Visual Studio, and the IDE I'll use for React is Visual Studio Code. So let's start by getting those installed. So for Visual Studio, I'm gonna open a browser and search for VS 2022 preview. And I'll just click the first link. And from there you can download the preview and install it. I've already installed it, so I'm not gonna do that again. When you're in the Visual Studio installer though, make sure you tick ASP.NET and web development. I'll just show you. So say you're in the installer here, you only need to tick this one, ASP.NET and web development. And yeah, you don't need the Node.js development one for this tutorial, because we'll be installing that separately and use command line tools provided by React. And even though Visual Studio has a React project template, I can't use it because for some reason I get a weird npm bug saying it can't start in the right directory or something. Right, so we've installed Visual Studio. Let's now do Visual Studio Code. So I'll just search for download VS Code in my browser and go ahead and install that. Not really any special configuration needed for it. For now, I'll cover that later when we start building our React app. Right, then for my command line, I'm using Windows Terminal. And you can just search for download Windows Terminal and install it from the Microsoft Store, or you can check out my fully featured video linked in the top right corner above me, where I show you how to set up a fancy Windows Terminal on Windows 11. Okay, so now we have all these things. Next up, I want to install Node.js, and that's the thing we'll need for our React development. So I'll just search for download Node.js, and I'll just hit the first link from nodejs.org. And in this tutorial I'll be using the LTS version, so go ahead and install that. Once that's done, open a terminal and you can type node-v to verify it's installed. Then it'll show you a version. So you should see version 14 dot something if you're doing this around the time of this recording, which is November 2021. Alright, then lastly we need the Entity Framework Core command line tools, and there's a Microsoft Docs article on how to do that. But I'll just search for EF Core CLI, and then it's the first link. And I'll also leave the link to this article in the description below, right? And you need the .NET command line tools to use these tools. And those should be included with the .NET SDK you got from installing Visual Studio. So in this article, we see how to set up the tools. So I'll just split my view and put the browser on the left and the Windows Terminal on the right. Yeah, and I'll just follow the steps. So I'll just copy this .NET tool install, right click in my terminal to paste. And I hit enter. There we go, it's installed, and you can verify the installation by typing .NET EF. And if you see this little unicorn, you're good to go. Okay, and there's one last free software I recommend for this tutorial, and that's to explore our SQLite database. So I'll just search for DB browser for SQLite. And you can install it using this download link. I already have it, so I won't install again. Right, so I believe I haven't forgotten to show you anything, I hope. So let's start developing now. I have challenged myself to do this all within an hour. So I'm just gonna start a stopwatch now. Okay, there we go. So I usually do backend to front end with little full stack applications like these. So let's start with building the backend. So I'm gonna open Visual Studio and I'm gonna hit create new project, and I'll just search for web API, and I'll pick the first result called ASP.NET Core Web API with the little C# icon, and I'll name the project all lowercase ASP.NET Server, and I'll set the location to my tutorials folder, and I'm gonna change the solution name to ASP.NET Core React Tutorial. Solution name is up to you, but I recommend you use the same project names as me to reduce bugs, and I'm not gonna place them in the same directory, so I'll hit next. And then for the framework, I'll keep .NET 6 LTS. I'm gonna leave the authentication type as none. HTTPS can stay ticked. Docker can stay unticked. And I'm gonna untick use controllers because we'll be using the minimal APIs. And I'm gonna leave open API support ticked. Then I'm gonna hit create. Alright, so Visual Studio has created our ASP.NET Server project, and I'm just gonna press the green button to see if it works. And yes, I'm greeted by this Swagger UI, so let's do this GET request. And also we get some example metadata back. Right, so I'll close my browser and go over to this auto-generated project and remove everything we don't need. But before we do that, I just want to show you how to enable a setting I have on, so that you're not wondering why my code looks a little different. I'm gonna go to Tools, Options, Text Editor, C#, Advanced. And I'm gonna scroll all the way down to inline, to this one, display inline parameter name hints. And I have ticked it and all the sub settings. Then I'll just hit OK. And this is a nice little setting that shows me the parameter names of the methods I'm calling. And I just find it makes coding easier. Enabling this is just a preference though. It's up to you. So if you're coming from earlier versions of .NET, you'll be pleased to see that there's only one C# file in here and only one folder. So I'll open this program.cs, and if I zoom out a little bit, we see that this file only has 43 lines, which is awesome, and what used to be startup.cs is now contained in this program.cs file. And on line 24 we see the get endpoint we just tested in our browser. If we hover over the map get, we see it takes a first argument of type string called pattern, which is basically the route of the API, and a second argument of type delegate called handler, and a delegate is basically a C# type that holds some lines of code that run when the delegate is called, or we also call that when the delegate is being invoked. Right, so when this delegate is invoked, we run this anonymous function or anonymous method, also called a lambda. And because the parentheses are empty, we know that this doesn't take any arguments. And then in the curly braces, we run the code. And all that happens here in the code is we get a weather forecast array with some random data, and that is returned to the client calling this API endpoint. Lastly, after the map get, we see a with name, and we won't be using that in this tutorial, but that's how you can name your endpoints, I believe, in your auto-generated Swagger UI. And we can find the model of which an array is returned at the bottom of this file. Right, so I'll just now delete everything we won't be needing. So first up, this model can go. Then the entire map get and the summaries array can go. And I'll just save. Right, and everything above can stay the same for now. Right, so let's start developing. And by the way, if you found this tutorial helpful so far, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Right, so I want to start by setting up Entity Framework and our database. So to get started with that, I'm gonna right click the ASP.NET Server project and hit add, and I'll add a new folder and name it data. So I'll just start off by creating our model, which is just a very simple data class with a few columns, which Entity Framework will convert to a SQL table for us, also called a code first approach. So I'll just right click this folder and add a new class, and I'm gonna name it post, hit enter, and I'll just change the class to be internal sealed. Internal meaning it's only available in this project, and sealed meaning it can't be inherited from. Then I'll just add some properties which will then be columns for our table. So I'll just do prop tab tab, and the first one is a public int called post ID, and I'll add a data annotation to this, so brackets and key, and just hit alt enter and import the required using statement. Right, and for the next one I'll make it required, and I'll give it a max length of 100, and I'll just do a prop again, public string, and I'll name it title, and I'll initialize it to string.empty. And by the way, ASP.NET data annotations, I find them a developer friendly way to add some metadata about your properties, and Entity Framework will look at these. And if you're doing something with Blazor, Blazor can also look at these and enforce the rules they dictate. Right, so for the last property I'll also do required and add a max length of 100,000. And I'll add a prop tab tab, change the type to string, and I'll name it content, and I'll initialize it to string.empty, which is just an empty string. Okay, then next up I want to configure Entity Framework, and we're gonna do that in a dbContext class, which is really your core class when you're doing stuff with Entity Framework. So I'll just right click data, add a class, and I'll name it app dbContext, which stands for application DB context. And I usually just do my database name, so app, and then add DB context to that. Right, so the first thing I'll do in this class is make it internal sealed again. So only this project, and it can't be inherited from. And in here I'm gonna inherit from db context. And Visual Studio doesn't know what that is yet. So I'll just right click it to bring up this quick actions and refactorings and install the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core NuGet package straight from our code editor. Awesome. So let's set this up. We only have one table, so I'm gonna add one db set. We'll just do prop tab tab, and I'll change the type to db set, and that has a generic type of the model. So for us that's post, and I'll name it posts. Alright, and we get a warning here saying that this property can be null, and I don't really like this warning, honestly. So I'm just gonna change the severity to silent. Right, and now I want to specify that we're gonna use SQLite as our database provider. So I'll just override the onConfiguring method. So protected override void onConfiguring, and that has a parameter of type db context options builder, and I'll just accept the suggested name, and we're only gonna run one line here, so we can use an arrow, and the line we'll run is db context options builder dot use SQLite, and I'll just add parentheses and an empty string. And Visual Studio doesn't know what this use SQLite is yet, because we need another NuGet package for that. And for this one we can't directly install it from the code editor. So I'll just right click the server project, manage NuGet packages, and I'll browse and search for Microsoft. And it already shows up here. So Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.SQLite, and I'll install version 6. Just make sure all your Microsoft NuGet packages are the same version. So for me it's .NET 6 and it just launched, so congrats Microsoft, really happy with .NET 6, I love it. Okay, and while we're here, I'm just gonna go to the Updates tab and update this swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core to the latest version. And that's for our auto-generated Swagger UI. If you don't update it, you'll run into a bug later on, just so you know. Right, so then I'll close this NuGet tab, and back in the db context class, we now see that the use SQLite method exists, and it's asking for a connection string. So let's just fill that in. So I'll do data source equals, and I'm gonna do dot for the current directory slash data slash appdb.db. So that will place our database in this data folder and name it appdb. Alright, so now one last thing I want to do in this class is to add some example data to our database, and we can override another method for that. So I'll just do protected override void, and we're gonna override onModel creating, and that has a parameter of type model builder, and I'll just accept the name. So to seed some posts, I'll just declare a post array, and I'll call that posts to seed, and I'll make that a new post array, and I'm gonna give that a length of 6. So we'll seed 6 posts. Right, then I'll just do a for loop. So int I starts at 1, and as long as I is less than or equal to 6, we'll seed the posts. So I'll do posts to seed at the index of I minus 1, and then I'll make that a new post, and then I'll do curly braces and set the properties of the post. So post ID equals I, and the title equals, and I'll do an interpolated string, post curly braces I, so post 1 for example. And then for the content, I'll do another interpolated string, and I'll do this is post I, and it has some very interesting content. I have also liked the video and subscribed. Alright, and I'll just add a semicolon, and below the for loop we'll actually tell Entity Framework to seed this. So we'll do model builder dot entity with a generic type post dot has data, and we'll pass in the posts to seed, and that will tell Entity Framework to seed the posts for us. Alright, so I'll just save all with Ctrl+Shift+S. Then I'm gonna go to a terminal. So I have two here, but you can open one with View Terminal. And if we do ls, we see everything that's in our solution folder. And strangely enough, there's a subfolder with the name of our solution. And I don't think that should be there because it's empty. Right, so if I do explorer dot, an explorer window opens in the current directory. And if we open the folder with our solution name, we see that it's empty. So I'll just delete it. Right, so then I'll close Explorer. Right, so to generate the database, we need to create migrations, and in there we basically tell Entity Framework how to generate our database exactly. So let's create those with the Entity Framework command line tooling. So I'm first gonna cd into the server project. So I'll type cd asp and hit tab, and then it auto completes. Right, and then I'm gonna do .NET EF migrations add, and then the name of the migration, and I'll just do first migration. And for the output directory, I want to do data/migrations. So I'll just add -o data/migrations. And then I'll hit enter, and we should get an error. Yeah, so we get an error saying we need another NuGet package for this. So I'll just add it via this command line window. So I'm gonna do .NET add package, and then copy and paste this package name. So I'll select it, right click, and right click on my current line in the terminal, and then I'll hit enter. And there we go, we see it installed the NuGet package with version 6. So let's try the migration again by hitting the arrow up key twice and hitting enter. And that should complete within a few seconds. And there we go, a migrations folder popped up in our data folder. So I'll just open this first migration file, and here you can see exactly how Entity Framework will generate our database and what example data will be added. You see the create table and insert some data. Right, so it looks good to me. Let's generate the database from this. So I'll just type .NET EF database update and let it do its magic and watch the data folder. And there we go. So we now see our AppDB pops up with some helper files. And let's just open this thing up in our DB browser for SQLite application. So I'll just start it. And if I open Visual Studio and this application side by side, I can just drag and drop the database in there, and then I'll maximize the DB browser. So we see our database has 3 tables, one called posts, one called EF migrations history, and one called SQLite sequence. Good. So let's now browse the data, and in the posts table we see that our C# properties are now SQL columns, and we have some rows with example data. So I'm happy with this. So the database portion is almost done now. I'll just close this Database Explorer app. Right, so now I want to make a static class that our minimal web API endpoints can use to perform the database CRUD operations. And that type of class is called a repository. So let's create that. So I'll right click the data folder, hit add a class, and I'll name it posts repository. And this can be a pain to type out, so please remember you can just copy and paste from the GitHub repository. I'll type it out though. So I'll first make this an internal static class. Right, and first up I want to do the read operation, so to get all the posts, and we'll also make them asynchronous. So internal async static task, and we're gonna return a list of type post, and we'll name it get posts async. Right, then for the method body I'll do using var db equals and then a new AppDB context. And this little using thing is the right way, I believe, to use your DB context. That makes it so that it's cleaned up by the garbage collector more efficiently after use. Don't quote me on that. But I believe I read in the Microsoft docs it's more efficient this way. Right, and we'll just do one line here. So we're gonna return await db.posts, so our posts table, and we're gonna do toList async, and I'll just hit Alt Enter on that and import the required using statement. Then I want to implement getting just one post, so I'm gonna do internal async static task, and we'll return a post, and I'm gonna call it get post by ID async, and for the parameter I'm gonna do an int and name it post ID. Right, and again I want to do using var db equals new AppDB context, and so in here I'll do return await db.posts, and we'll use link here. So I'm gonna do first or default async, and I'll just take a post object and do an arrow, and we want to return where the post.postID equals the post ID from the argument, right? If the thing is running, this parameter is called an argument and something is up. And yeah, this can return null, so that's expected. So I'll just set this to silent. Okay, then I want to implement the create operation so that new posts can be added to the database. So I'll just do an internal async static task and we'll return a bool node to tell the caller of this method if it worked or not. And I'll name it create post async. And I want to take a parameter of type post and I'll just call that post to create. Alright, and again I'll do a using statement and then var db equals a new app db context. And I want to do a try catch block. So try, and we'll catch the exception and just name the variable e. And instead of throwing it, we will return false. It's very simple, right? But in the try block, we'll do await db.posts.add async. And we'll add the post to create. And we will return await db.savechangesAsync. And that will persist the added post to the database. And so if the amount of changes are more than or equal to 1, it worked. And if not, the boolean will be false. So then it didn't work, right? So this will return false. Okay, then next up is the update operation. And we can basically copy and paste the create method for that because they are very similar. So I'll copy and paste it and just change the name from create to update post async. And I'll rename this parameter with Ctrl+RR to post to update. And in the try block, we're not gonna await, but we'll do db.posts.update. And we'll pass in the post to update. And we'll still return the await db save changes async. And the rest can stay the same. Right, then finally the delete operation, so that posts can be deleted from the database. And I'll just copy and paste the update post async. And I'll rename it to delete post async. And instead of a post, we'll take in an int named post ID. And in the try block, we'll do post to delete. And that equals await. And we'll use one of our methods here. So we'll await getPost by ID async. And we'll pass in the post ID. And then we will db.remove. And we'll remove the post to delete. And we will keep the same return. Save changes async. And the rest can stay the same. Right, so we're done with the entity framework / database portion of the application. Let's now add some web APIs. And we're gonna do that straight in the program.cs file. So I'll just close all the other tabs. So close all but this. And let's start by adding an endpoint for getting all the posts. So below use HTTPS redirection, I'll just add app.mapget. And so for the first argument, I'll pass in the route. So that's going to be /get all posts. And for the second argument, the code we want to run, I'll do an anonymous method or anonymous function, and that's async, and it has no parameters. Then I'll do an arrow, and we will await posts repository. I'll just hit Alt Enter and use our ASP.NET Server data namespace. So in our static repository class, we will call the getPosts async method. There we go. And that really is the getAllPosts endpoint done. Right, so let's test it out. I'll start the project with the green arrow button, and there we go, it shows up. So I'll just hit try it out and execute. And awesome, we get all our posts back from the database. Right, so I'll just close my browser. Before we implement the rest of the endpoints, I just want to make some changes to our auto-generated Swagger UI. So on line 8, I want to change the add Swagger gen and add a little info. So I'll just expand this, and we have a setup action object here, and I'm gonna call that Swagger gen options, and use an arrow, and then add curly braces, and then go to the next line, add curly braces, fix the formatting here. Right, so in this Swagger gen options, we will do Swagger gen options dot Swagger doc, and I'll just set the version actually to v1, and for the OpenI info we'll do a new and then pass in the title. So title equals ASP.NET React tutorial for me, and here I'll do version equals v1 and add a semicolon. I'll just do a new open API info, Alt Enter that, import the required using statement, and the version needs to be capitalized. So that's that, a little more information in our Swagger UI. And I want this Swagger UI to always show up, not only if the environment is development. So on line 17, I'll just cut this out, remove the is development if statement and paste. Okay. And then I want to add some Swagger UI options to this, and we can make use of an anonymous function again for that. So use Swagger UI, and in there we'll take a Swagger UI options as the parameter, and then an arrow. Then on the next line I'll add curly braces, and then I'll do Swagger UI options dot document title. That will be the name of the HTML page above in the browser tabs bar, and I'll just name that ASP.NET React tutorial, and I'll add a comma, then a semicolon, and I'll also do Swagger UI options dot Swagger endpoint. There I'll do /Swagger, so that's the URL, /v1 /Swagger dot JSON, and then for the name we will do web API serving a very simple post model. So this is really the definition or the description, I guess. And I want to set the Swagger UI options dot route prefix to string.empty. Alright, and there's one last change we need to make for this to work, and that's in the properties launch settings.json file. And that will make it so that our app starts up without a launch URL. So just the HTTPS localhost and then the port number without /swagger. So for all the profiles here, I'm just gonna remove the entire launch URL line. Save all. Right, so now back in program.cs, I want to add a tag to our map get so that the name of the little block above our endpoint changes. So after this map get call and before the semicolon, I'll do enter and then I'll do dot with tags. And there I'll pass in the posts endpoints as the tags. Okay, so let's start the server again and see if our changes worked. Awesome. So we see our changes have made the Swagger UI more clear. Right, so I'm gonna close my browser and now I want to continue with implementing the endpoints for all the CRUD operations. So below this first map get, I'll just add the get endpoint for a specific post with a post ID. So I'll do app.mapget. And for the route, I'm gonna do /get post by ID / and then curly braces and then the post ID. And that's the parameter our method will receive here. So for the handler, I'm gonna do another anonymous function, so async, and the parameter will get it from the route here. So that's gonna be int post ID. Then I'll do an arrow to the next line, then curly braces, and I'll declare a local variable of type post, call it post to return. I'm gonna set the value to await posts repository dot get post by ID async and pass in the post ID. And we're gonna check if that post to return isn't null, then I'm gonna return results.ok and return the post to return. And results.ok is a type included in ASP.NET Core, and that allows us to return specific HTTP methods. Alright. And for the else, if the post is null, we will return a results.bad_request. Alright. And then one last thing for this one is the tags. So I'll do with tags. And I'm gonna do the same tags as the get all posts. So I'll just copy and paste it from there. Alright, then I want to do the create post. And for that I'll just copy and paste this map get. And I'm gonna change it to map post. So we map this to the HTTP post method or verb. And the route for this is create-post. And the handler is async. And we will receive a post. And I'll call that post to create. And here I'm gonna remove this line and I'm gonna declare a bool. Call that create successful. I'm gonna set the value to await posts repository dot create post async. And for the post to create, we'll pass in this post to create and a semicolon. And so we'll check here if the create was successful. Then we will return an OK response with the text, just simple create successful. Else we will return a bad request and the with tags can stay the same. Then for the update post endpoint, I'm gonna copy and paste this map post and change it to map put. So this is the HTTP put method. And I'm going to change the route to update post, and we will receive a post to update from the client. And here I'll rename the create successful with Ctrl+RR to update successful. And from the post repository we will call update post async and pass in the post to update. And if the update is successful, we will return update successful, and the rest can stay the same. And then finally for the delete, I'll copy and paste put and change it to map delete. And here I'll do delete dash post dash by dash ID slash, and we'll take a parameter and we'll name it post ID. And in the handler I'll change the parameter to int post ID, and I'll rename this update successful to delete successful with Ctrl+RR, and that value is await post repository dot delete post async, and we'll pass in the post ID here. And if the delete is successful, we will return delete successful, and the rest can stay the same. Okay, so that's all the CRUD operations done. Let's try them out. So I'll start the server again, and let's first get all the posts. Okay, so that still works. Right, so now let's get a post by ID. I'll do post ID 1. Awesome, that works too. And if we try for a post that doesn't exist, so I'll do 10, we should get a 400 BAT request response back, and also we get the 400 response back. Okay, let's try to create a new post. I'll leave the post ID as 0, so the entity framework or the server automatically fills that in for us. I'm gonna set the title to new post, and I'll set the content to new post content and execute that. And there we go. We get a 200 OK response back with a little text saying create successful. Let's get all the posts again. And at the bottom, we see our new post has been added, and the post ID has automatically been filled in for us. Right, so let's now update this post. So in the update endpoint, I'll try it out. Fill in 7 as the ID. I'll just change the title to updated and the content to updated content. Hit execute. And there you go, we get a 200 OK response back with update successful. Let's get all the posts again. And there we go. It now has been updated. And I just want to check the database real quick to verify that our changes have persisted. So I'll open this DB browser app again, and I'll open it side by side with Visual Studio. Go to the Solution Explorer and drag and drop the database in there, browse the data, and there we go. We see the CRUD operations we've been doing via our API have been persisted to the database, so that's good. So finally I'll delete it. So go back to my browser again, took everything in, and I'll just delete the post with an ID of 7, and we get delete successful back in the Database Explorer. I'll refresh, and now it's gone. Awesome. So clients can now perform CRUD operations to our database via our ASP.NET Web API. So I'll just close my browser and the DB Explorer, and back in the program class, I just wanted to say that, if I zoom out a bit, this isn't the cleanest way to implement an API, but with the new minimal APIs in .NET 6, you can do it this way. And I'm trying to keep this app very simple, so I'll just leave everything in the program.cs file. Right, so our backend work is done for this tutorial. If you followed along this far, thank you, and if this helped you, please like and subscribe. Right, so we can now continue with our React frontend, and to do that we'll use the create React app command line utility. So first of all, I'm going to go to a terminal, and I'll just type WT to open the Windows terminal, and that will open a Windows terminal in this location, and I'll open that side by side with my browser. So in the browser I'll search for create new React app, and I'm gonna click this first link from reactjs.org, and if we scroll down a little to the heading with create React app, it says create React app is a comfortable environment for learning React and is the best way to start building a new single page application in React. Sounds good. So let's use this to create our React project, and the command we need to run is listed below. So it's npx create React app and then your app name, and I want to create it next to our server project, so I'll just type ls and make sure I see ASP.NET Server there. So we're in the root of our solution folder. Right, so I'll just run the command. So npx create -react -app, and I'm gonna name it React Client, and hit enter. And I highly recommend you use the same name as me to avoid bugs later on in the tutorial. And while that's creating, I'll just explain what npx is. So npx is a Node.js command line tool which became available with npm version 5.2.0, and it enables npm to execute command line Node.js tools without having them to be installed globally. Previously we had to install the React command line tools first, but with npx that's not necessary anymore. Okay, so I'll just speed up the video until it's done. And there we go, our React project has been created. If I do ls now, we see another folder shows up called React Client. So let's cd into that. So I'll do cd react and then hit tab, enter, and I'll just maximize the terminal. And React created this project with a Git repository included, which we'll create on our own later on for the entire solution. So we'll just delete this one now. So I'll do rm to remove, and I'm gonna remove the .git folder. I'm gonna do -r and -force and then hit enter. And so now you see this little master branch bar is gone. So that means the repository is gone. Right, so now let's view this in our code editor. And I prefer Visual Studio Code for JavaScript development. So sitting in this React Client folder, I'm gonna type code dot, and that will open the current directory in Visual Studio Code. And I'll just trust the authors. I want to check if this React app runs, but before we do that, I'm gonna change the default browser for React development to Microsoft Edge, and that's just my preference to have my personal browser and development browsers separated. I mainly use Google Chrome, but the differences between Google Chrome and Edge are, in my opinion, pretty small, since Edge basically copied Chrome, I guess. So to do that, I'm first gonna go to a terminal. So view terminal, and in here I'm gonna run npm install -- save and then cross -env. Then I'm gonna go to the package.json file, and I'm gonna change the start entry in this script object to cross-env, and then uppercase browser equals, and I'm gonna set that to ms-edge.exe. And this is optional, obviously it will default to your system default browser. I'm just explicitly saying use Microsoft Edge. Right, so let's see if our React app runs. So in the terminal I'm gonna do npm start, and then we should get a browser, and there we go. So our React frontend is working. So back in the terminal I'm gonna hit Ctrl+C and then Y to stop it from running. So before we get coding here, I'll just show you the extensions I have installed for React development. These are optional, but I like to use them. So in the extensions tab, I have the bracket pair colorizer, which makes your code more readable. I have editor config, mainly for code formatting, and we'll set that up in a minute. And we have the ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native snippets. That just contains a bunch of handy code snippets. And lastly, I have the material icon theme for better looking icons. So there's one last setup thing I want to do before we can start developing our React app, and that is to set up that editor config and set up code formatting. So I'll just go to my browser and I'm gonna search for JavaScript editor config, and I'll use this first link from editorconfig.org. And to use editor config, you just need to place a .editorconfig file at the root of your project you're using it in. And on this page we see an example one. So this is the one I'll use. So I'll just copy everything in here, and then back in VS Code in the Explorer I'll hit the new file button, and I'm gonna name it .editorconfig. And it's very important that you spell that right. You see the icon pop up here, so that needs to be the name. And then I'll paste the contents of my clipboard in there, save it. Right, so now I want to tell VS Code to use this editor config as the code formatter. So I'll go to File, Preferences, Settings, and I'm gonna search for formatter. And as the default formatter, I'll set it to this editor config for VS Code. Awesome, I think that automatically saves. So now I'll just close all. Right, so that's all the setup we need to do. Let's test out if it's working. So I'm gonna go to the src folder, the source folder, and I'll open app.js. And I'm just gonna mess up the formatting here, just so we can test it out. So now it's all messed up. And then I'm gonna press Shift-Alt-F. And there we go, you see the formatting is fixed. We're using the standard JavaScript formatting, which is two spaces indentations. With that out of the way, let's get started developing, and I'll start by deleting everything we won't need. So I'm gonna delete this setup tests, report web vitals, logo, index.css, app.test.js, and app.css. Okay, and then inside index.js, I want to remove the React strict mode. So I'll just cut and paste the app component out, and I'll move this all to one line. And I'm also gonna remove this report web vitals function call and the comments. And from the imports, I'll remove the report web vitals and the index.css. Right, then in the app.js file, I'm gonna remove all the imports, and I'm just gonna type capital React and hit tab, and that will import React from React, and I believe that's not necessary, but I prefer it. Then in the return statement, I'm gonna remove all the contents of the div and remove the class name. So we're left with just an empty div, and inside the div I'll just add hello world just to test it. And lastly, I'll remove the export and change the function declaration to export default function. And that does the same thing as having it below here. I just prefer this syntax. It's up to you. So that's all the cleaning up we need to do. Let's run this again. So in the terminal, I'm gonna type npm start, and I'm probably already, over an hour and barely got started with the React frontend. So a slight miscalculation there. I underestimate how much time development takes, but I'm also explaining it, of course. That also takes time. Okay, so there we go. We have a very empty React app now. So for the UI, I'll be using Bootstrap, which according to them is the most popular CSS framework for developing responsive and mobile first websites. So I'll just open another tab and search for React, install Bootstrap, and I'm gonna use the create React app link. So yeah, you have npm packages where Bootstrap is already divided into React components, but I'm gonna use the vanilla implementation for this tutorial. So we're just gonna npm install Bootstrap. So I'm just gonna copy this npm install line, and then I'll go to VS Code. In the terminal, I'll stop the project from running, and I'm gonna paste the npm install line, so that will install Bootstrap into our React project. Right, then back to my browser, we see we need to import the Bootstrap CSS in index.js. So let's do that. I'll just copy this and close the tabs, and then back to VS Code. I'll go to index.js, and at the top I'll paste it. Okay, so Bootstrap should work now. Let's try it out. So I'll close the index.js, and let's change the returned JSX here. So I'll set the class name to container, and I'm gonna add another div. And there I'll set the class name to row and do min ph 100. So it is 100% of the vertical screen height. And then I'll add another div and add a class name, and I'll do col. and I'll set that to display flex, so dflex and flex column. I'm gonna justify content center and align items center, and that will center everything in this div vertically and horizontally. And then I'll just add a heading 1 and say hello Bootstrap. Right, so I'll just run the project again to see if Bootstrap works. Awesome, so you should have a centered heading now saying hello Bootstrap. So Bootstrap works. The next thing I want to do is display all the posts in a table. So back in VS Code, below this return statement, but still inside the app function, I'll just go one line or 2 lines below it, and I'll just make a function that returns the table JSX. So I'm gonna do function, and I'll call it render posts table, and there we're gonna return. And for the root, I'm just gonna wrap it in a div, and we're gonna set the class name to table-responsive, so that's just a Bootstrap table, and I'll add MT5 for margin top 5. Then I'll add a table element and set the class name to table-bordered, and I'll do border dark. Then I'll add a t-head, so a table head, and in there a tr, so table row. And then I'll add a few table headings, so th, and I'm gonna set the scope attribute to col. And for the contents, for the text, I'll do post ID parentheses pk, so primary key. And then I'll do shift alt down arrow to kind of duplicate this line downwards. And I'll change the contents to title, duplicate again, change it to content, duplicate again, change it to CRUD operations. Alright. Then below the table head, I want to do a tbody element and add a table row there, so tr. And then I'm gonna do a th, and I'm just gonna set the scope to row. And that's for the post ID, so I'll just hard code the data now. So I'll do 1, and then I'll add a td element, so that's table data, I believe. And for the text I'll do post1 title, duplicate that downwards, and change that to post1 content. Then for the buttons, I'll add another td and hit enter to open it up. Then I'll add a button element, and I'll set the class name to btn, btn dark, btn large, mx3, and my3. And for the text I'll do update, and I'm gonna duplicate that, change the text to delete, and I'll change the color to btn secondary and remove the margin X and margin Y. So let's now use this function below the hello Bootstrap. I'll call the render posts table function. So I'll just do curly braces to indicate that this is JavaScript code. And then I'll call render posts table and add parentheses. Okay, so our app was running all this time, and React hot reloads our changes for us. So the table should show up in my browser now. So I'm gonna go back to my browser, and there we go. We see our table. Right, so the next step is to fill this table with all the posts in the database coming from our web API. So I'll just go back to VS Code, and to keep things simple, we're going to use the JavaScript Fetch API to interact with our ASP.NET Web API server, and we're going to use React State to store that data here in this app component. So first of all, I'll add useState in the import. Then in the app function on the first line, I'm gonna add the post state. So I'll do const and use JavaScript array destructuring, and we'll destructure a posts array and a setPosts function, and I'm gonna set the value to useState, and I'll pass in an array there. So we'll just store all the posts from the server in a JavaScript array, and this is the default value, which is an empty array. Right, so now we have something to store the posts in. Let's get them from our web API, and I first want to figure out what the address of our web API is. So for that we'll go back to Visual Studio, and I'm gonna open ASP.NET Server, Properties, Launch Settings.json, and I want to interact with the HTTPS variant. We see this application URL and then the HTTPS one. I'm just gonna select it and copy that. And you can't use mine because in .NET 6 these are randomly generated for each project, I believe. So back to VS Code. Below the useState, I want to implement the getPosts function. So I'll do function, and I'll just use this snippet here. I'm gonna call it getPosts tab. The params, we don't have any params or parameters, so that can stay empty. And I'll just declare a variable, so const URL, and that equals, and a string, and then I'll paste the server URL from my clipboard and add a slash, and for the route I'll do get dash all dash posts. So then I want to do the actual fetch request, so I'll do fetch and then pass in the URL, add a comma, then I want to add an object, so curly braces, and in that object I want to specify the method, the HTTP method or verb we're gonna use here. So I'll do method colon and then single quotes get. So we're gonna do a get request to our server. Then after this single parenthesis, I'll just enter to go to the next line, and then I want to do .then. So this is asynchronous JavaScript, I believe. Feel free to Google that and read up on it. You could also do async and then a bunch of stuff, but I prefer to use .then, and that will run, I believe, when this fetch thing completes. Right, so .then, and we'll take the response from the server and use an arrow, and on that we will call response.json. And so when that's done, so on the next line I'm gonna do another .then parentheses, and then we'll take a posts from server array and use an arrow here, and then I want to add curly braces, and in there let's just log. So I'll do log tab, so console log the posts from server, and I also want to set it in our state here. So I'll call set posts and pass in the posts from server. Right, but imagine this fails. Let's create something to handle that. So I'll do .catch, right, and then parentheses, and then another pair of parentheses, and we'll take in an error object and use an arrow and then curly braces, and let's do something with this error object. So I'll log it, right, and I'll also do an alert for it. So a little alert window pops up at the top of the browser and pass in the error. Alright, so now that we have this getPosts function, let's have something call it, and I'll add a button for that. So in the main return statement, I'm gonna change the h1 a little bit, and I'll just first change the text, this is optional, to ASP.NET Core React Tutorial, and I'm gonna cut it, and instead I'm gonna add a div, so it's wrapped in a div, and then I'll paste it and use our formatter here. So Shift Alt F, so that formats nicely. And below the heading 1, I want to add another div and give that a class name and set it to empty5, so margin top 5. And then I'll add the button. And for the onClick event, I want to call our getPosts function, and don't add parentheses because we don't want it to run here. We only want it to run when the button is clicked. Right, and I'm gonna add a few classes to this button. So I'll do btn, btn dark, btn large, and w100. And for the text, I'm gonna do get posts from server, and I'll just add another button. I'm gonna duplicate this down with Shift Alt down arrow, and I'm gonna make this onClick empty for now. So I'll just pass in an empty anonymous function, and for the class name I'm gonna do btn, btn secondary, btn large, w100, and I'll just add margin top 4 to this one. And for the text I'm gonna do create new post, and I see I made a typo here. That should be server. Alright, so let's check this out. I'm gonna go back to my browser, and nice, we see the buttons show up. So I'm gonna open the browser DevTools with F12 and go to the console tab, and I'll just clear it. Before we press the get posts button, we need to start our API, but I'm just gonna press it to see if we handle the error that will come, and there we go. So it failed to fetch, and that's correct because the server is not started. So back in Visual Studio, I'll just start it. Right, then in the React browser window, I'll just hit F5, and I'm gonna hit get posts from server again, and it should fail again because of CORS. So in the console here we see that we get a CORS policy error, and CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing, and it's basically a security thing that restricts resource sharing. So resources are things like files between computers on different networks, and we need to set up a CORS policy in our Web API server where we allow our React client to interact with it. basically. So let's do that. So back in Visual Studio, I'll just stop it from running. Then I'll open program.cs, and this is where we want to set up our course policy. So below var builder, I'll add it. So I'm gonna do builder.services.add course, right? And we're gonna use an anonymous function here. I'm gonna do options and an arrow. On the next line, I'll do curly braces, and let's run something. So we will run options.add policy, and then add parentheses. And for the name, I'll do course policy, and I'm gonna add a comma, and we will do another anonymous function or lambda. So I'll do builder, arrow. So I'll actually bring this builder to the next line, and then I'll do enter to go to the next line, add curly braces, and then let's run some things. So I want to run builder, and on the next line I'll do .allow any method, and I'll also do .allow any header, and I'll also do with origins, and then add a semicolon after that one. So that's the final one. And for the origins, we'll first pass in the route of our local React application. So that is http://localhost:3000. Then I'll add a comma. And I'll also add kind of a holder one for our React app when it's running in Azure later on. So that's going to be https://. Then I'll do app name dot Azure static apps dot net. Okay, so now we've added the course policy. Next, we need to tell ASP.NET we want to use it when an HTTP request comes in, and that happens in the HTTP request pipeline. So between use HTTPS redirection and our first API endpoint, I'll add app.useCourse, and then pass in the course policy string. So I'll just copy and paste it from here, right? And the policy name needs to be exactly the same as we specified here. So that's why I copy and pasted it, right? So if we now run the server again, it should work. We should be able to communicate with it via our React app. So just refresh that. And if I press get posts from server now, we see that something shows up in the console, and that's a JavaScript array with 6 objects in it. So let's expand it, and awesome, we see that the array contains our post objects. So now that we have those post objects, let's display them in our table. So I'll go back to VS Code, and in the main return statement, I'm gonna display the posts table only if our posts array has entries, and we'll use the JavaScript logical AND operator for that. And that will only execute the statement to the right of it if the condition to the left of it evaluates to true. But I'll just show you. So I want to check if the posts.length is greater than 0. And the logical AND operator is this, so AND. So if this is true, render the posts table, else basically do nothing. Right, so now that's done. Let's edit the post table to display the posts coming from our web API. So in the body here, I'm gonna cut out the table row, and I'm going to use a JavaScript array.map function to render out each post in its own table row. So I'll just add curly braces to say this is JavaScript code. Then I'm going to post.map, add parentheses, and then we're going to use a post parameter and add an arrow and parentheses. And then on the next line, I'll paste the table row on my clipboard. And this kind of does kind of comparable with a C# for each loop, I guess. And I'll just format this with Alt-Shift-F. So I want to give each table row a unique key. And we'll just use the post.postID for that. And let's make this dynamic now. So I'm gonna change the text of this table heading here to be dynamic. So I'll do post.postID. And I'll also make the title dynamic. So I'm gonna do post.title. And for the content, I'll do post.content. And the last change to the table I want to do for now is add a button that empties the posts array. So below the table, but still inside this wrapping div, I'll add the button. So a button element. And for the onClick, I want to do an anonymous function. So parentheses and an arrow, and there I want to set the posts, so set posts to an empty array. And I have forgotten to add an equal sign. So there we go. onClick equals set posts to an empty array. And for the class name, I want to add a couple of classes, so btn, btn dark, btn large, w100. And for the text, I'll do empty react posts array. Awesome. So let's check the results. So I'm going to go back to my browser with the React app. I'll just hit F5 and get the posts from server. And awesome, the table is now filled with posts from our web API coming from our SQLite database. And if I hit empty React posts array, we see the table disappears because the array has 0 or no entries. Right, and if I refresh this and get the post from server again and empty it again, it works. Awesome. So this is a pretty nice milestone. If you followed along this far, thank you. And if this tutorial helped you, please like and subscribe. Right, so our next task is to implement all the CRUD operations in our React client. And I want to start by storing all the server endpoints in a separate JavaScript file. I usually call that file constant. So let's create that. So in VS Code, I'm gonna store it in its own utilities folder. So in src, I'll just press the new folder button and I'll call it utilities. And in there, I'll create a new JavaScript file. So constants.js. Okay, so we're gonna have two API URLs here, one for our local development environment and one for our production environment running in an Azure Static Web App. So let's start with our development environment. So back in app.js, I'm just gonna copy the server URL from the fetch request without the slash, and then in constants I'm gonna declare our first variable, which is const, and then I'll just capitalize everything and then put underscores for spaces. So I'll do API base URL development equals, and then I'll do single quotes for a string and paste the server address. And then I'll duplicate that line and change it to just something temporary for our server URL running in Azure later. So I'll just do app name .azurewebsites.net, and I'll change the variable name to API base URL production. There we go. Right, so next up I want to declare a new JavaScript object containing all the routes for our endpoints. So const endpoints equals, and then an object, and then I'll capitalize everything again. So I'll start with get all posts, so get underscore all underscore posts, and set the value to single quotes, and then our endpoint route. Then for the next one I'll do get posts by ID, and I'll set that to get dash post dash by ID, then create underscore post, and I'll set it to create dash post, and update underscore post, and I'll set that to update dash post, and finally delete post by ID, and I'll set that to delete post by ID with dashes. And finally I'll add a semicolon to this object, and these need to match the route you declared in your server project. So then I want to declare another JavaScript object called development, which contains all the full API routes for the development environment, and we'll then create another one to contain all the production URLs. And at the end we will check whether we are running in production or development, and then return something based on the outcome of that. Just show you. So const development equals an object, and I'll just add the semicolon. And then I'll do API underscore URL get all posts, and then I'll do an interpolated string. So these backticks, I think they are called, under the escape key on my keyboard. Then I'll do a $sign and curly braces, and we'll first pass in the API base URL development. Then I'll do a slash, and then another $ and curly braces, and then I'll do endpoints dot get all posts. So that's the full API URL to get all the posts, and it's basically the same process for the rest. So I'll just duplicate this line downward, and the second one is API URL get post by ID, and that will take the endpoints dot get post by ID. And I see there's a typo in there, so I'll just hit F2 to fix that. And I'll copy the line down again, and I'll change it to API URL create underscore post, and that will be endpoints dot create underscore post. Copy the line down, and then it is API URL update underscore post, and take endpoints update post. Copy it down again one final time, and that will be API URL delete post by ID. And we will use endpoints dot delete post by ID. Okay, so these are all the endpoints for our development environment. I'm gonna copy and paste that and change it to production. And I'll just change the values of this base URL to be production instead of development. So I'll select that, copy, and just double click them all and paste. Save that. Right. So finally, I want to declare a variable that holds this development or production object based on whether our React app is running in a development or production environment. Make that the default export. So I'll do constants, so the name of what we'll export, and that equals process.env, so process.environment, and we will query node underscore env, and then I'll do a triple equals, and we'll check if it is development. And then I'll do a ternary, so a shorthand if else statement basically, with a question mark, same as in C#. And so if node env equals this development, we will return our development object, else we will return the production object. Okay, and finally we will export default constants so that our other code can make use of these API URLs. Right, so that's the constants file done. I hope I haven't made any typos. I'll just close it. Right, and back in app.js, I'll just refactor our fetch call to use our new constants file. So I'm gonna import it. So I'll do import constants from, then I'll use double quotes, /utilities/constants. Right, and then I'll change this URL to constants.api URL get all posts. There we go. And while we're here, I also just remove this console.log. Right, so let's see if this still works. So I'll just start the project and start the server too. Okay, so the server is running. Then in the React app, I'll just press get posts from server. And there we go, it still works, but now the routes come from our constants file. Right. And by the way, our little application is even responsive. So if I hit F12 and toggle device emulation and select mobile M, you can see that it's responsive. So I'll just disable that. Right. So now we're ready to implement the rest of the CRUD operations, and I want to do the create operation next. So when we click the create new post button, I want a little form to show up where we can fill in the post title and content and save it to the server. So let's implement that. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code. So I want to do the post create form in a separate component. So I'll create a new folder in src and name it components. And there I'll create a new file and I'll call it post create form.js. And here the React snippet extension comes into play. So there's a few ways you can create React components, but I like the export default function one. So let's create one of those. I'll type RFC, which stands for React Functional Component, and hit Tab to implement the snippet. And the default name is the file name, which is good. So I'll hit Tab, and I'll first of all add all the imports. So on top of React, we're going to use the React state here. So I'll import that. So comma, curly braces, and useState. And I'll also import our constants. So import constants, and VS Code already knows. I'll just hit tab to import that. So I'll first start with the display code in the return statement, and I'll just add a semicolon to the end of it. We're gonna display a form so that the user can give in some data to create a new post, right? So I'm gonna add a form element, and I'm gonna give that a class name of W100 and padding X 5. And I'll add a heading 1 and give that a class name of margin top 5. And I'll just name it create new post. Then I want to do a div that will contain the input for the post title. And I'll give that a class name of margin top 5 2, and I'm gonna give it a label. And for the text I'll do post title, and for the class name I'll just do h3 and form dash label. And I'll also add an input, and I'm gonna set the value to something we haven't created yet, and the value is the content of the input field, so what the user gave in. But we also can set that from the code, and we will bidirectionally bind it to a variable in this post create form function. But it'll make more sense in a few minutes. So I'll do form data dot title. For the name I'm gonna do title, and I'm gonna match this with the property name in the server, but keep it lowercase. That's fine. ASP.NET automatically converts that, I believe. I'll set the type attribute to text, because this is a text field, and I'll also set the class name to form-control. And for the onChange event, we will do handle change. We'll create that function in a minute too. And this input can actually be self-closing. So I'll remove this closing tag and just add a slash here so that it's self-closing. Right, then I'm gonna copy and paste this title input and just change it to the content. So I'll change the margin top to 4, change the label text to post content. For the input value, I want to do form data.content. For the name, I'll do content. The type can stay text. The class name can stay the same, and the onChange can stay the same. So that's all the inputs. I want to add a submit button so that a request can be made to the server. And I'm gonna start with an onClick event, and there we'll just call handle submit. We'll also create that in a minute. I'm gonna give that a few classes. So btn, btn dark, btn lg, w100 for width 100, and margin top 5. And I'll give it a text of submit. and I'll copy the line down. And I also want to add a cancel button. And in the onClick, we'll do an anonymous function, so parentheses arrow. And then I want to do props, which we'll add in a second. And from that props, I want to call onPostCreated, and that will be a function in this app.js file, and then we'll pass in null. And I'm gonna change the text to cancel, and I'll change the color from BTN dark to BTN secondary and change the margin top to 3. So when this function is called in the app.js, we will hide this form and come back to the main screen. Right, so we're calling a bunch of stuff that doesn't exist yet. So let's implement the rest of this. I want to start with this form data. So we're gonna store all the data from the form in its own JavaScript object using React state. So let's add that on the beginning of the function here, above the return. I'll add const and use array destructuring, and I'll call it form data so it matches this. Add a comma. I'll also add set form data, and I'll set it to useState, and for the initial value I'm gonna pass in some initial form data, and let's create that initial form data object. I'll do const and I'll just copy and paste the name, and that equals object dot freeze. So we can modify that. I'll add parentheses semicolon, and in there I'll add curly braces, and I'm gonna set the title to postx, up to you, and I'm gonna set the content to this is postx, and it has some very interesting content. I have also liked the video and subscribed. I hope you did. Okay, so now we have something to store the form data in. Let's now implement the event handling functions. So this handle change, handle submit. And I'll start with the handle change. So below the initial form data, I'll add it. So const handle change equals, and I'll do an anonymous function, and that takes a parameter, and we get the event object from this onChange. And then an arrow and curly braces, and I'll just add a semicolon at the end. And really all we'll call here is set the form data. So we're gonna set our form data to the values the user gave in, right? So in here, I'll add curly braces for an object, and I'll do ... form data, and then I'll do brackets and go to that event and go to target, and that is basically the HTML element, and then go to name, so that's this name, and we will set that to e.target.value and add a comma. So we're gonna set the property in this form data that has the same name as this input element. So say for title, we give something in. This will be title, and then set the value to the value the user gave in. Right, so that's the handle change function. Let's now do handle submit. So I'll do const handle submit, and again I'll do an anonymous function, and we're going to receive an event again, then an arrow and curly braces. I'll just add a semicolon at the end, and I'm going to call e.prevent default, and that's gonna prevent the default action from happening when a form is submitted, and I think that is to reload and stuff. We don't want that. We're gonna handle the form submit ourselves. Then I'll create a post to create object. So const post to create equals a new object, and I'll set the post ID to 0 and let the server handle the post ID, and I'll set the title to form data dot title, and I'm gonna set the content to form data dot content. Add a semicolon, and then before we do the fetch post API call to the server, let's declare the URL, so const URL, and we will use our constants file again. So constants.api URL create post. Okay, and then we'll use the JavaScript fetch API to do the post request. So send something up to the server, right? And I'll just start by copy and pasting the get request from app.js. So this one, copy and paste. Right, so then I want to change the method to post, and below that I'm gonna set one value in the headers object. So I'll do comma headers and set that to an object. And we're going to set the content dash type to application slash JSON. And I believe this is necessary if you're sending JSON up to a web API. I'll just add a comma below that, and then I'll set the body to JSON.stringify, and we're going to send up this post to create, and this will convert it to a JSON string, I believe, and we don't need the semicolon. Right, so in this second then I'll rename the post from server to response from server. So I'll hit F2, change it to response from server, and instead of setting the posts, I'll just console log the response from the server. So log tab and log that response from server, and the catch can stay unchanged. So that's the fetch request done. Then lastly, I want to call a function in the app component that a post has been created, and we'll use the props for that, and we also called it here. And props are mainly a way to send data between React components. So I'm gonna add the props here to the function declaration so that React knows this component has props. Then below the fetch request, I want to call props.onPostCreated, and then pass in that post to create. Right, so this post to create form is done now. Let's finish implementing the create feature in app.js. So I'll close it, and back in app.js, I'll first implement that onPostCreated function. So below the render posts table function, I'll just add a empty line between, and I'll just tuck it in so it's easier to see. I'm gonna do function onPostCreated, add parentheses, curly braces, and that's gonna take in a created post object, right? If we hit cancel, we're gonna call this onPostCreated and pass in null, and if it's successful, we will receive the created post. So let's check if the created post equals null, and if that's the case, we will return, so do nothing else. I want to do just a simple alert, and I'll use backticks for an interpolated string, and I'll just give in post successfully created. After clicking OK, your new post titled, and then I'll just add double quotes, then a dollar curly braces for an interpolated string, and then we'll pass in the created post dot title. Then after the double quote will show up in the table below. And after the alert, so after OK is clicked, we will call getPosts. Okay, so that's implemented. Let's now work on displaying the post create form when the create button is clicked. And I'll just use React state with a boolean for that. So I'll scroll to the top of the file and just tuck in the getPosts function. Then below the posts state, I'll add it. So do const brackets showing create new post form. And we'll also add a set for that. So copy this variable name, paste it, and just add set and properly camel case it. So set showing create new post form, and that equals use state, and for the default value I'm gonna do false. So now let's display it, and before we can do that we need to import it. So I'll do import post create form from double quotes dot slash components slash post create form, and then I want to go to our main return statement, and below the render posts table we'll use a logical AND operator to conditionally display the form like this one here. So just add curly braces and check the showing create new post form, and I'll do and. So if it's true, and then that HTML element sign, and then type in the post create form, and for the on post created property or props or parameter, however you want to call it, I'll set it to on post created. So kind of like a delegate in C#, and I'm just gonna add a self-closing tag, right? So almost done here, but in the render posts table logical AND operator, I want to add another check, which will check if the showing create new post form boolean is false, because I don't want to show the table and the create post form at the same time. So I'll just wrap this in parentheses and I'll add a condition. So I'll do and showing create new post form equals false. And let's also hide this first div with the title and the buttons when the form is showing. So I'll also wrap that in a JavaScript logical AND operator so that it only shows when the showing create new post form boolean is false. So curly braces, showing create new post form equals false, and then I'll add parentheses, go in there, press enter, and then we'll show this div. So I'll cut and paste that in there. And our formatting is messed up, I think. So I'll hit Shift Alt F to fix that. So we're almost done with the create feature now. One of the last things to do is to display the form when the create new post button is clicked. When the button is clicked, we'll simply set the showing create new post form boolean to true. So on click, anonymous function can stay, but let's do something. So we'll do set showing create new post form and pass in true. Right, so that's done. Then just a little something in the on post created function on the first line here, regardless of the created post was null or not. I want to call set showing create new post form to false so that the form stops displaying. Right, so we're finally ready to test this out and make sure both projects are running. And then I'll go to my browser and open the DevTools with F12, go to the console, and let's first get the post from the server. Okay, so that still works. Then if we click create new post, I have made an error, it seems, and that's quite a stupid mistake. So I'm trying to use this initial form data before I've declared it. So I'm just gonna cut it and declare it first. Save that. So let's try that again. Sorry for that. And there we go, yeah. So if I hit create new post, everything should disappear and the form should reveal itself. So there we go. And now if we click cancel, we come back to on the main screen. So I'm gonna hit create new post again and I'll change the title a bit and the content and hit submit. And awesome, we get a pop-up saying it worked. So let's hit OK. Great, and we come back to kind of the main screen again. And in the console, we've gotten a create successful message back from the server. So I'm happy with that, it worked. And our newly created post shows up at the bottom of the table here. Great. We're actually almost done with the development part of the tutorial now, because we can pretty much copy and paste create for the update feature, and delete should only take 5 or 10 minutes to implement. But there's a little problem still with the create new post, because it's really narrow. So I think I've made a typo again. I meant to make this form the root element and not this div in the post create form. So my bad. I'll just cut it and replace the div with that. Hit Shift Alt F. So everything is formatted nicely. Save that. Back to my browser. And there we go. That was my intention for the design. So yeah, a few errors. Sorry for that. I think everything works now. And you know, that's real world development guys, also typos. And if you're sitting with someone like pair programming, they say, hey, you've made a typo. But if you're doing videos, you don't always see it, right? So I see another typo here. So just fix that real quick. So I have also liked the video and subscribed. So let's continue with the update feature. So I'm gonna go back to VS Code and I'm gonna copy and paste the post create form component. And I'll change the file name with F2 to the post update form. So open that up and I'm gonna change this function name to post update form 2. And let's start by editing the form JSX display code. So in this return statement here, and really we only need to change the title, and I'll make it dynamic as well, because in this component we'll also receive the post that's being edited from the props or from the properties, right? So instead of create new post, I'll do updating the post titled and then curly braces. Then I'll do props.post.title. And I'll just put that in quotes and add a period. Okay, and just one more change here, and that is in the cancel button on click. There we'll call onPost updated instead of onPost created. So I'll change it to onPost updated and pass in null. Right, so let's go over the rest. I'll just go to the top and we'll set the initial form data to the values of the post we'll receive from the props. So instead of post X, I'll do curly braces and do props.post.title. That does not have to be in curly braces. And for the content, I will do props.post.content. Okay, there we go. The useState and handle change can stay the same. Then in the handle submit, I'll rename the post to create object to post to update with F2. And I want to set the post ID to the post ID of the post from the props. So I'll do props.post.postID and I'm going to change the URL to the update one. So API URL update post. Then in the fetch, I want to change the method to put instead of post. And then one last thing is to finally call props.onPostUpdated instead of created when we're done. Right, so that's the update component done. That was really quick. It's almost the same as the create form, and that's for CRUD operations in general. Update is very similar to create. And we can now finish developing the rest of the features in app.js. So I'll just close everything except that. Right, so let's first of all import the post update form. So I'll copy this line down, change it to post update form, and just copy and paste that here. For the state regarding the post update form, we'll use an object that holds the post that's currently being updated, and if that's not null, we'll show the post update form, So I'll just add it below the showing create new post form state. So I'll do const array destructuring and I'll name it post currently being updated and copy and paste that variable, change it to set and then proper camel casing, post currently being updated equals use state, and for the default value we'll pass in null. So null is the absence of data, right? And then I want to implement the onPost updated function that's being called from the post update form component, and I'll do that below the onPost created function. So I'll just tuck it in. So I'll do function onPost updated parentheses curly braces, and I'm gonna pass in the updated post, and we will set the post currently being updated to null because we're done with that. Then I'll do an if statement. So if the updated post equals null, then I just want to return. And then I want to make a copy of the posts array. We will persist the updates to the post in the array here straight in the memory instead of doing another API call. So I'm going to do let posts copy equals and then brackets, and I'm going to do ... posts to copy the array in this new variable. And then I want to find the index of the post that has been updated. So I'll do const index equals and then the posts copy dot find index, and there I'm gonna add another parentheses and name the variable will loop over posts copy post, and the second argument I'll name current index, and this is an anonymous function, so I'm gonna add an arrow and curly braces, and this is kind of a for each loop. So this loops over all the posts. So I'll do an if statement here, and if the posts copy post, right? So the post in the post copy array that's currently being looped over, dot post ID equals the updated post dot post ID, then will return true, and that will set the index of the current index here. So then we have the index of the updated post. Then I want to check if that index isn't, so exclamation equals, so is not -1, then I want to set the post copy at the index of our index to updated post, right? And then I want to do set posts, so update the posts array state and pass in our posts copy. And lastly, I want to do an alert and do an interpolated string with backticks, and in there I'll do post successfully updated. After clicking OK, look for the post with the title, and then I'll do double quotes and an interpolated string and pass in the updated post dot title. And after that I'll do in the table below to see the updates. And as always, I encourage you to think critically how this can be done better, and if you see improvements, improve upon my code and let me know in the comments below. I'll just tuck this in. Okay, let's now work on the display code in the main return statement. So we'll display the post update form if the post currently being updated variable or state isn't null, and we'll use the JavaScript logical AND operator for that again. And I'll just add it below the post create form, so curly braces, and I'll check if the post currently being updated isn't null. And if that's the case, so and, I want to render out the post update form. Right? And for the post property, we'll pass in the post currently being updated. Right? And for the on post updated property, we'll pass in our on post updated function. Okay, so that's that. Then I want to add one more condition where we show the table with all the posts, and that is that the post currently being updated must be null, right? So I'll just add another condition here. So the post currently being updated triple equals null. And I'm also gonna add that to the display code above with the main heading 1. So I'll just copy that, triple equals null. So, and I'll wrap this in parentheses. So if this showing create new post form equals false, and the post currently being updated equals null, then display this. Okay, so that's the update feature almost done. We just need something to happen when the update button is clicked in the table. So I'll just go to the render posts table function. Let's add an on click for this update button. I'll do on click equals and curly braces, and I'll do an anonymous function, and then do set post currently being updated to the post of the current iteration of this map loop. The post update feature should be done. Let's try it out. So I'll just start the project again and start the server 2. Then I'll get the posts from the server. Nice, that still works. And I'm just gonna hit update on the last one. And I'm gonna change the post title to updated and the content to updated and hit submit. And nice, we get an alert saying it worked. I'll hit OK. And there we go. We now see the post is updated. If I go to the developer tools and the console, we see update successful. Nice. And that's the message the server sent back. Awesome. So there's one last CRUD operation left to implement, and that is delete, and that shouldn't take too long. So let's jump straight in. So I'm gonna go back to VS Code, and with the render post table still expanded, I'll start by implementing the delete button on click. And we'll do a lot inline, right? And it's not the cleanest way, but keeps it simple. So I'll do on click equals curly braces. And again, we're gonna do an anonymous function. So parentheses arrow. And then let's run some code. So I'm gonna do another curly braces. And I'm gonna check if the window.confirm, so if the OK button is clicked on an alert, and for the alert text I'll add parentheses, and backticks for an interpolated string. And I'll ask, are you sure you want to delete the post titled, and I'll add double quotes and a dollar and curly braces, and then I'll pass in the post dot title and then a question mark, and then after these two parentheses I want to call delete post, and that's when the OK button is clicked, and then we'll pass in the post dot post ID. Right, so the next thing to do is to implement this delete post function, and I'll just copy the name and I'll add it below get posts. So I'm gonna do function and then paste it, add parentheses, curly braces, and this takes in a post ID. And let's just start this off by copying and pasting the contents of get posts. So I'll copy that, tuck it back in, paste, and then I'm gonna change this URL to delete post by ID, and I'll make this an interpolated string with backticks, and select this and copy it, and add a dollar curly braces and paste it inside there, and then I'll do a slash, then another dollar sign curly braces, and append our post ID. Then for the fetch, I'll change the method to delete, and I'll rename this posts from server with F2, change that to response from server, and instead of setting the posts, so I'll delete that, I want to just log console.log the response from the server. So I'll do log and pass in that response from server. And then I want to call onPost deleted and pass in the post ID, and that does not exist yet, but that's the actual delete post function done. I'm gonna tuck it in, and the last thing to do is to implement that onPost deleted function. So I'll scroll down, tuck in render post table, tuck in onPost created, tuck in updated, and so below this onPost updated I'll implement onPost deleted, and I'll start by copy and pasting onPost updated, change it to onPost deleted, and that's gonna take in the post ID. I'll just name that deleted post ID. I'm gonna remove this set post currently being updated line and remove the null check, and I do want to copy the posts array, and I do want to get the index of the post that's deleted, but instead of the updated post.post ID, I'm gonna check against the deleted post ID, so our argument here, and then if the index isn't -1, I want to do posts copy.splice, and I'll just remove it from the post array we have in our React client here, so that we don't have to do another API call for that. So I'll do index, 1. So at the index of this index, we will remove one element, and then I'll call set posts post copy, that can stay the same, and then for the alert message when we're done, I'll just remove that entire interpolated string, and I'll just do single quotes, post successfully deleted, after clicking clicking OK. Look at the table below to see your post disappear. Awesome. So we're done with the feature development part. I'm just gonna tuck in this function. And yeah, let's try this out. I'm gonna go to my browser, just hit F5. I'm gonna get the post from server, and let's just try deleting the latest post. And we get an alert asking if we're sure. I'm sure, so I'll hit OK. And after that, we get a confirmation alert saying it worked. So let's look at the table and I'll hit OK. And there we go, it disappeared. Nice, we get a message from the server saying the delete was successful. So I'll just clear the post array and get the posts from server again. Hit F5, get it again. And I'm gonna try to delete another one. And there we go, it disappears. I'll try deleting 2. Awesome, that disappeared too. Just refresh again, get the post. Yeah, so it has been persisted to the database. Right, so the feature development part of this tutorial is done. So we've hit another milestone. Thanks for viewing so far. If this tutorial helped you, please like and subscribe. Right, so to put the cherry on top of the tutorial cake, I'll also show you how to publish this React app and your web API to Azure and set up a simple continuous integration pipeline for the React app and show you how these two different technologies running in Azure can communicate with each other over the internet. And you'll need a free Microsoft Azure account with a pay-as-you-go subscription, or the free trial subscription might work too. And you'll need a free GitHub account, and everything I'll show you how to create is free, so you won't get any bills from Microsoft with the resources we'll use. Okay, so I'm just gonna close my browser and I'll stop both projects from running. So I'll start with publishing our server, and we'll publish that to an Azure App Service resource. So first of all, I want to set the database to copy always so that it gets sent up to Azure. So I'll go to data, go to our DB, properties, and set it to copy always. And I'll also do this shm and val, and these are little helper files for SQLite, I believe. I think they speed up things or something. We'll just copy them over as well. Right, so then I'm gonna right click the server project and hit publish. Then I'm gonna select Azure, hit next, and I'm gonna go for Azure App Service Windows, and I'm just gonna hit the plus to create a new app service, and I'm gonna name it ASP.NET Core React Tutorial -ASP.NET Server. The name is up to you, obviously, and I believe each resource in Azure must have a unique name, so keep that in mind. For the resource group, I'll select my tutorials, and resource groups are basically just folders containing resources in Azure, and so each app service runs on something called an app service plan, but in Visual Studio it's called hosting plan, and I'll create a new one. And each hosting plan can have multiple app services, I believe. And I usually prefix these with ASP-, and then I do the name of my app service. But in this case, it's gonna be too long, so I'll just shorten it a bit to AR, so ASP.NET React, and then I'll do tutorial-ASP.NET Server. For the location, I'll do West Europe. Select the one closest to you, and for the size, I'm gonna do 3, so that we don't get any bills from Azure. Then I'll hit OK, and looks good, and I'll hit create. And now Microsoft will create the resources in our Azure account straight from Visual Studio, and this usually takes 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, so it has been created. Then I'll click next, and I'm gonna skip the API management. That's kind of for way bigger applications. And then I'll hit finish. Right, and so there's one more thing I usually do, and that is to include the .NET runtime with our project we're sending up to Azure, and that reduces bugs for me. So I'm gonna click this little pencil on deployment mode and change it to self-contained. Then hit save. And finally I'll hit publish. And that will send our server project up to Azure, and hopefully it's gonna run. The first time you do this, it takes the longest, but usually less than 5 minutes for me with smaller projects. I'll just speed up the video. Okay, so the deploy is done now, and a browser window popped up with our server running in the Microsoft Azure cloud with this auto-generated name, and it has the name of the Azure resource name, and then it gets .azurewebsites.net. So that's all correct. And I'm just gonna try all the endpoints, so get all posts. Awesome, that works. Get post by ID. Okay, that works too. Then I'll create a new post, leave the ID as 0. For the title I'll do new post. For the content I'll do new post content, execute that, and we get 200 create successful. Let's get all the posts again, and there we go, it shows up. Then I'm gonna update it. Execute that. Awesome, we get 200 and update successful. I'll get all posts again. There we go, it's updated. Now let's finally delete it. There we go, delete successful. Let's get all the posts again. And there we go, it's gone. Right, so all the endpoints work. There's a few more things we need to do to complete this server deployment. So I'll just close my browser, go back to Visual Studio, and I'm gonna set these database files back to do not copy. Okay. And that makes it so that our production database doesn't get overridden by our development one. And then I'm gonna copy this site URL. And by the way, you can always open this publish thing by doing right click and publish. Right, so I'm gonna copy this by clicking this little card. Now I want to fill that in as the production URL in our React app. So I'm gonna go back to Visual Studio Code and go to the constants file, so utilities constants, and here we have this production URL. I'm just gonna replace the existing one with the one on my clipboard. Let's save that. So our React app is ready for publishing now, and we're gonna do that via the Azure portal. So I'm just gonna go to my browser and go to the Azure portal. So portal.azure.com. Right, so in the Azure portal, I'm gonna hit create a resource, and I'm gonna search for static web app. And here's where you can host your static web apps in. So web apps built with front-end frameworks like React, Angular, Blazor, Vue, etc. For the subscription, I'm gonna do pay as you go. For the resource group, I'll do my tutorials. Then for the name, I'll just do ASP.NET Core React tutorial. So the name of the solution dash React client. So the name of the project. For the plan type, I'm gonna keep free so that we won't get any bills from Azure. For the region, I'm gonna do the same one as the server. For me, that's West Europe. And for the source, I want to use GitHub, but we haven't created a repository for this yet. So let's do that first. So I'll do that via Visual Studio. Open that up. And I'm gonna go to View, Git Changes. Usually it's here. Then I'm gonna hit Create Git Repository. And the local path will default to this solution, which is correct. My account is correct. The owner is correct. I'm gonna keep the repository name as the default and just leave the description empty for now. Then I'm gonna hit create and push. And if something from saving comes up, just save everything. So Microsoft will now create a Git repo with a nice git ignore for us and push that up to GitHub. So if I go back to my browser now and open GitHub and go to the repository, there it is. So go to the repository, we see that it contains our ASP.NET server and our React client and some other files. Okay, so let's go back to the Azure portal now. And if we click sign in with GitHub and authorize, we can select an organization and a repository. I just created one with my own name. For the repository, select the correct repository. So for me, it's ASP.NET Core React tutorial. And we're gonna select the only available branch, which is master. Okay, and then we just need to fill in these last few settings. So for the build presets, we'll select React. And this application is very important. This needs to point to the location of your React project in your GitHub repository. So it starts at the root of the repository, this slash, and then we need to pass in the location of the React project. So for us, the path is, our repository root and then React client. And for you, it's whatever you named your React project. So I'm gonna select that, copy the name, go back to the Azure portal and paste it in here. So slash React client. Okay, and then I'm gonna leave the API location empty because that's meant for Azure Functions and not for a fully fledged web API, so we don't need it. And for the output location, I'm gonna keep build. Then I'm gonna hit review and create, and finally hit create. Right, so when it's deployed, I'll go to the resource. And now a deployment should be running in our GitHub repository. And to view it, we can just click the deployment history and then the link there, the GitHub action runs. And that brings us to the actions tab for this repository. And we see that Microsoft Azure created a commit for us and now an action is running. So I'm just gonna click it to take a closer look at what's happening and click this build and deploy job. So we kind of see exactly what's happening. So we see it's doing a bunch of stuff. So GitHub actions are basically actions or things that run when something happens in your repository. For example, in our case, the action gets triggered by a push to the master branch, and that action basically takes our React project, tells React to build it and upload the result of that to an Azure Static Web App. Right, so this action will fail now because we have a few warnings in our React code and a flag is set that warnings should be treated as errors. So I'll just speed up the video until it fails and then we'll fix that. Okay, so we see that it failed. So I'm gonna go back to Visual Studio Code. And first of all, in the terminal, I'll just do git fetch to get any changes from our remote GitHub repository. And I'm gonna do git pull to sync our local repository with the remote repository. And that's just that commit Microsoft Azure did for us. I'll do git status again and we're up to date. So, and we see that a .yml file has been pulled in, and that's a GitHub action YAML file, and that basically contains all the information needed to run the GitHub action which publishes our React app to Azure. So let's first fix the thing that causes the action to fail, and we can do that in package.json. We'll just open that. And in the scripts object, we need to change the React script build. And we actually want to set the CI flag to false. And that stands for continuous integration. And that's true by default, I guess. And that thing makes it so that code warnings are considered as errors. And errors cause the GitHub action to fail. So before React script build, I'm gonna add CI equals false and then do and. So I guess we'll run both these commands. Okay, so that's fixed. Now I want to take a look at that YAML file, and we can see it here in the React client folder. So let's go to Windows Explorer, and in the terminal I'll just type explorer dot to open Windows Explorer in the current directory, and then we need to go one folder up, and there we see a .github folder, and that's where our YAML files are. I'll just open that, then open workflows, and here we see our YAML file with an auto-generated name. So I'll just change that name to something more descriptive. So I'll do React client CI/CD, and I'm gonna select that and copy it. And I want to open this file now. I like to edit YAML in Visual Studio Code, so that's my default. I'll just open that with enter. And I'm not gonna go into specific GitHub YAML syntax here. I'll leave a link in the description below for if you want to read up on that. But I just want to make a couple of important changes here. So first of all, I'll change the name to be the same as the file name. I'll paste that. And we only want this action to run if our React code or this YAML file is updated. So let's add that. And we can do that by specifying specific paths we want this action to listen to. So we have branches master, and below that gonna do an enter and shift tab so that the indentation is correct. It's very important in YAML, else it won't compile. Then I'm gonna add paths, colon, and then do a tab, and then we can pass in all the paths we want GitHub to check. So I'm gonna do single quotes and do React client / ***. So everything in the React client folder, and then the / and ***. So that means everything in that React client folder. Obviously use the name you did for your React project. And so below this, I'll add one more. So a dash, single quote. Then I'm gonna do .github / workflows / ***. So everything in the workflows folder. Again, make sure the indentation is correct. I had some frustration from that in the past. Right, so that's all the changes I wanted to make for the React client. So let's commit that again and push it up to GitHub and see if it works now. So in the terminal, I'll go up one folder using cd ... and I'm gonna do git status again, and we see our changes. Then I'm gonna do git add dot to add everything, and then I'm gonna do git commit -m for the message, and for the message I'll do fixed a CI/CD bug and improved the GitHub Actions YAML file, period. Okay, enter, and let's push that up. So I'm gonna do git push, and then I'm gonna go back to my browser, go to GitHub, and in this repository I'll just click the Actions tab again, and there you go. It shows up and the name has been edited and it's running. So let's take a look. And we now see that our React app is being uploaded to Azure. I'll just speed up the video while it does the magic. Alright, and now we see it succeeded. So if you click build and deploy here, scroll down a bit, we see deployment complete, visit your site. And let's just click this URL. And now we see our deployed React app. Awesome. And yeah, it shows up, but it won't work yet, because if we click get post from server, it'll try and fail in a few seconds. Because in the server CORS policy, we don't allow any requests from this published React app running in Azure. This Azure URL, right? So let's fix that. So I'm gonna copy the URL from the top bar here. I'm gonna go back to Visual Studio, go to the Solution Explorer, and I'm gonna update the CORS policy. So I'll go to program.cs, and here it's this second link I want to replace with the URL of our app running in Azure, and remove this slash at the end, else it will be treated as a different URL and it won't work. Okay, so if we publish the server again to Azure, everything should work. So I'll just right click it again, hit publish, and hit publish. And small changes like these usually take less than a minute to publish. Right, so now it completed and it opens the server in my browser. So I'll just go back to the React app, hit F5 and hit get posts from server again. And now we see that it works. Awesome. I know all the endpoints work because I've tested it in some practice projects, but I'll just update one of the posts to verify. I'll do updated and updated. Hit submit, hit OK. Go to F2, we see update successful, and also here in the table we see that the post has been updated. Yay. Nice, so everything works. There you go. There's an example of how you can connect a React app with an ASP.NET Web API and have it up and running in the Microsoft Azure cloud. We'll just commit this last change to GitHub and verify that no action runs for it because it's a change in the server project and not the React project. I'll go to Visual Studio, go to Git changes, and you could do this from the command line if you want. So for the message, I'll do small change to program.cs. No actions should run. And I'll stage all, commit staged, and push that up. And if I now go to the GitHub repository, go to the Actions tab, and just refresh that a few times, we see no action shows up. But if I go to the code and go to the commit, we do see the commit came in. And there's no check mark or little X here. And that's the result of the action that commit triggered, I believe. So that works too. Okay, so let's check the stopwatch, and yeah, I managed to go through this in like 3 hours 23 minutes. So it's that's a little longer than 1 hour. A slight miscalculation on my part there. But yeah guys, that marks the end of this tutorial. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was useful to you. Make sure you like and subscribe because it helps the channel grow. You can download source code and other resources from the description below. I want to thank all Patreon supporters for making this video possible. If you're not already one, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because these videos take quite a long time to make, and unfortunately you can't pay rent with goodwill. And lastly, I invite you to join our Discord community. Here you can have a friendly chat with other developers and get help if you're stuck on something. You can find all the links in the description below. That's all from me. Good luck in your developer journey.